So it's exactly 12. I want to start the session. I would like to welcome you all to AUC Online Socrates Cafe's celebration of World Philosophy Day 2020. World Philosophy Day was introduced in 2002 by UNESCO, the UN Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, and is celebrated each year on the third Thursday of November with the following objectives. It's a quote from UNESCO's article: to renew the national, sub-regional, regional, and international commitment to philosophy, to foster philosophical analysis, research, and studies on major contemporary issues so as to respond more effectively to the challenges that are confronting humanity today, to raise public awareness of the importance of philosophy and its critical use in the choices arising for many societies from the effects of globalization or entry into modernity, to appraise the state of philosophy teaching throughout the world with a special emphasis on unequal access, to underline the importance of universalization of philosophy teaching for future generations. It's my pleasure to introduce Professor Judith Butler as our main guest in today's event. Judith Butler is an American philosopher and gender theorist. She's the Maxim Elliott Professor in the Department of Comparative Literature and the Program of Critical Theory at the University of California, Berkeley. She is the author of several books, including Gender Trouble, Feminism and the Subversion of Identity, Bodies That Matter, On the Discursive Limits of Sex, Undoing Gender, Who Sings the Nation State, Language, Politics, Belonging, that she wrote with Gayatri Spivak, and her recent book, The Force of Nonviolence. Her works have influenced many areas of philosophy, including third wave of feminism, queer studies, political philosophy, ethics, and literary theory. She's one of those philosophers who combine philosophy with activism and has inspired many activist movements across the globe. Welcome to our session and thanks for accepting my invitation, Professor Butler.
Um, it is my great honor to be here, and thank you very much for your kind invitation.
Today's event is in a Q&A question format and will last for 40 minutes. Students and I will be posing questions to Professor Butler and she will then answer. During the session, if you have got questions from Professor Butler, please use the chat box and raise hand option. Please keep your microphones muted unless you're permitted to present your question. Before starting the conversation, I would like to ask your apologies if I faced any problem with my internet connection because it's quite unstable in Kyrgyzstan. Today, our main focus will be on gender issues. And before going into this, I would like to ask you about the current pandemic. As you know, this year's World Philosophy Day's theme is the current pandemic, to look at the meaning behind the pandemic from different philosophical perspectives. I would like to ask you, Professor Butler, how the current pandemic once more showed the deep global inequality, that some lives are more grievable than others, as you put in your recent book, The Force of Nonviolence.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I am delighted to be here, and I thank all of you who um, uh, have arrived via Zoom. Um, I would say right away that the pandemic is, of course, a source of great suffering and great fear. It is also, as we know, a situation in which people find themselves isolated from one another. And yet, it's also a time in which we are asked to pause, to reflect, and to think about our world, because the the fact is that the virus can affect any of us or all of us. No one is immune. No country is immune. No person. No. In some ways, it establishes a radical equality. We are all susceptible. We we breathe the air. um, we connect with other people. we touch surfaces. We don't always know what is being uh, um, exhaled in our direction, nor do we know what we are exhaling in the direction of another. So the pandemic teaches us perhaps something about equality. We are equally susceptible, equally vulnerable, but also that we live in a world in which we do share the air, in which we live in proximity with others, and we don't always know how we are affecting others, and we don't always know how others are affecting us. So it's from this position of unknowing, am I being affected? Can I affect another? Affect, infect. It's from this position of unknowing that we think about our social world and indeed our global world. Um, so, on the one hand, I would say the pandemic allows us to think anew, that is to say, in a new way, about our equality and also our interdependency. At the same time, we see that many countries are suffering more than others because there is inadequate healthcare facilities. Many regions are suffering more intensely because people don't have shelters that in which everyone can keep distance from one another. Um, I was reading today about the situation in India, which is, of course, very intense, um, very frightening. The levels of infection are extremely high, but especially among the poor. Um, in the United States, it is the racial minorities who are very often discriminated against, who tend to die more often than the white population because they are not given the same access to health care. They are discriminated against by healthcare institutions. And because healthcare is not something that my government thinks everyone should have, right? It's like, oh, if you have a job, you can have health insurance. But there's no sense that, oh, we as a country will provide health care for everyone. We don't have that idea, or if we have that idea, we are attacked for having that idea. And yet, healthcare is a right that everyone should have, and I believe it is also a human right. Um, I think during this time as well, we have a chance to think about the radical inequalities, who has shelter, who does not, who has access to food, who does not, who is literate, can read and understand what is happening in the world, who has no access uh, to reading and writing. And we see these inequalities everywhere, um, also along the line of race and also along the line of gender. So if we ask who in the world is most likely to be poor, illiterate, and vulnerable to violence, we find that women are uh, among those who are most likely to be poor, illiterate, and subject to violence. So that is a gender inequality. And so the struggle for equality, the struggle to achieve a better world, is one that has to analyze those inequalities and has to also develop a, a vision of what it would be to live in a world characterized by uh, radical equality. Um, and in that way, the struggle for gender equality is linked with the struggle for racial equality, is linked with the struggle for food and healthcare and shelter, because people are equally deserving um, of shelter, of food, of healthcare, of being able to live freely without fear of violence, to to walk down the street without fear of violence, to live in their homes without fear of violence. So the question of gender is, I think, there all along. Um, so some have said, oh, the pandemic opens up a new world. We can remake the world because the world came to a stop. But maybe, and it is good that we have new visions. At the same time, the pandemic lays bare radical social inequalities across the world. So we must face that, and we must decide how best to address that. I suppose, lastly, I'll just say that philosophy is a field that asks fundamental questions. It's defined in a way by the questions that it asks. Um, so one question is what is justice? Another is what is equality? What is freedom? These are three major questions that belong to political philosophy. And of course, there is another question, two other questions. One is, how do I live? That would be a question that belongs to moral philosophy. Uh, but then there's the question, how do we live? Where the we that I'm asking about is not just we in California or the United States or Kyrgyzstan or India or China, but the we in its most expansive sense. How do we in this world live together? How ought we to live together? What kind of world ought we to be making together? These are fundamental questions, I would say, that belong to political philosophy. I also think they belong to social movements struggling for equality and freedom and justice. And although we find philosophy in the university, we also find philosophy in our ordinary lives and in the struggles that we have. When we pose that question, how ought I to live, or how ought we to live, we are already philosophers. You could be driving a cab, you could be working on a farm, you could never have read Plato. It doesn't matter. If you ask that question, and almost everyone asks that question in one language or another, you are already inside philosophy.
Yeah, thanks for you. And now I have received a couple of questions from AUC community and from the audience. I want to ask them. Like one asked that how is gender studies important for social equality?
Okay. Well, social equality is the equality of people in society. And we can maybe agree, I hope we can agree, that all people should be treated equally and that we seek to live in a society that is characterized by equality. The institutions are equally available, the educational institutions are equally available and affordable. All the social goods that we value should be equally available to everyone. And yet, to achieve that aspiration, we have to ask who is suffering from inequality. And gender is one way of naming that inequality. Race is another. Religion is another. I know in Kyrgyzstan you have many religions coexisting, but you also have a hierarchy. And there is a question of who is considered mm, more superior or less superior or more inferior. There are these issues everywhere in the world, um, and um, and so gender is in the way of social equality. It is one form of inequality that any effort to grasp social inequality has to accept. Um, Women are not born unequal. There's nothing in them that is less valuable than men. Um, they are treated unequally and then regarded as unequal and then assumed to be unequal. But this is a presupposition that we as philosophers might think about. Why do we accept that? Why do we accept the roles in which women are cast and the roles in which men are cast? Why do we think that sexuality always takes one form, the form of heterosexuality? Does that deny the complexity of human sexuality, of human life? If we seek to establish equality, we must examine our prejudices in order to overcome them, to regard others as equal and treat them as equal, and build institutions that have equality as a defining principle.
Mhm. Yeah, like in this region in Central Asia and Afghanistan, social inequality and gender inequality is ignored and kind of supported by functionalistic justification. Like poor rich or man woman distinction is important for the society to function smoothly. They are God given. And what's your response to this? What kind of consequences can it have?
You know, I think that it is important to understand um, that for many people, their religions, whether it's Islam or Christianity or Judaism or Hinduism, really, and I can think of more. There are ways of defining what a man is, what a woman is, or what a man should be, what a woman should be, and what their relationship to each other should be. So these are very deeply held beliefs um, that many of us learn from our family or our religious institutions. And for many people, it defines who they are and their understanding of what it is to belong to society. And if you start to ask questions about those categories, you could be considered a threat to the family or even a threat to religion. Um, and and yet, mm, in many religions, there is a place for those who don't fit within the gender binary, who are neither fully masculine or fully feminine. In many religions, there's also a doctrine of love. Christianity has a very strong doctrine of love, but it also has some of the most conservative views on uh, gender. Um, there is we can find in many religions an openness towards others who are different from ourselves. These, these, can, these principles can be found in many religious texts. So I'm not against religion. I think, though, that certain forms of institutionalized religion, and especially those that are allied with the government or the nation, establish a way of life that they call their own culture, their own nationality. And when intellectuals from California or New York or London or whatever it is come with their theories, they're considered to be poisoning the local culture. And yet, it seems to me that in my travels in many places, I always find people who have questions about gender. You don't you don't have to live in my neighborhood. Actually, in my neighborhood, they're very conservative people too. They don't want questions about gender. Um, but everywhere I go, people ask me questions or they explain to me their anxieties. Uh, um, they don't like gay and lesbian social movements because they fear that they will destroy the family. And yet, there can be heterosexual family here and gay or lesbian family here. They can coexist. They can cohabit in the world without destroying each other. All that's destroyed is the idea that there's only one form of family, right? It's true, that's destroyed. But the family's not destroyed, just its privileged place as heterosexual. It's very hard sometimes to get people to open their hearts and to live with that kind of diversity. It frightens them. They've lost their sense of being natural, of being God given, but gave maybe God produced a diverse number of people who are internally complex. We can accept that as a religious precept or as a philosophical precept, that we are different from one another and that we are internally complex, and that to live according to a doctrine of love is to learn that complexity, not to fear it, and to find a way to live with it in a peaceable way, without violence and without phobia.
But the problem is that in this region, that diversity is unseen. Like in this region, we don't have terms for gender, homosexuality, heterosexuality, or agenders. Yeah, they are just coming into discourse, but they are not very popular. It means that like those groups, diverse groups, they remain without any defined identity in the society. Like you have focused a lot on identity issues, sexual identity, gender identity in your works. Like what do you think, why such identification is important, why it's important for those diverse society to be seen and to have identity in their society?
Well, you know, my book Gender Trouble was in favor of the subversion of identity. So uh, I don't um, I don't think
Mhm.
identities are the most important thing. I think how we live together is the most important thing. How we produce freedom, how we struggle for equality. For me, that is the most important thing. Now, um, you don't have to have the word gender to tell me in your own language. How do you describe somebody who is a man, but he's not really regarded as a man, or maybe he's different, or a woman, but maybe more masculine? I mean, maybe it's a description, maybe it's a way of referring, maybe it's a verb. You know, in Chinese and in Japanese, there's no gender, there's no word gender. It's always a translation from English or the Romance languages, but there's a way of inflecting verbs so that you understand gender. It doesn't have to be the equivalent of the English. I mean, all what does it mean really when Simone de Beauvoir says one is not born, but rather becomes a woman? She's saying that, well, someone is born, perhaps called, oh, it's a girl, it's female. Yes, but then there's a life trajectory. What does she do? Maybe she loves men, maybe she does not. Maybe she wants to be a mother, maybe she does not. In other words, what it means to be a woman is negotiated in society. Um, and it's not, you can't tell from the sex that one is born into, the sex that one is assigned, what kind of person you will love and what kind of life you will lead. It doesn't follow, right? It can't be inferred. It can't be developed out of the very idea of sex. There's a rupture there where historical forces and one's own freedom come together and you find your way. Like how many of the girls here thought they were going to the young women here thought they were going to universities. And when you got to universities, how many of you thought you would be studying what you're studying now? Just a small example of like what it means to live in a way that to be surprised by life, not to always be following the exact role that you are prescribed, but to be negotiating that role. You don't have to refuse it radically, but you find your way with it, and that's a small but crucial form of freedom. It's a form of subversion that allows you possibly to live a more livable life, to live more easily, to breathe more easily, to love better, to affirm the world and life better. So I mean, gender is really nothing other than the idea that sex does not predetermine what you will be in life. That is that is all it says. I know that's a terrifying idea to certain people, but it can describe the way many of us are already living, regardless uh, of whether or not we have the word gender. I mean, you don't need the word. Don't take the word. Refuse the word. Doesn't matter. There's another, use another language. Use the one that is better for you.
But like, uh, as we said, we don't have those terms, the terms that they are the core of your ideas in most of your works. Like, if someone wants to translate your works in the local languages, like how should that person translate them?
They find another way. They move into, don't, I mean, my view is you don't let the English impose itself on you. You have to set the English aside and ask yourself a different question. How would this be explained in this language? Right? So many people who have, I mean, my early work on gender is in 27 languages. I mean, it's in Russian for those of you who speak Russian. You can see that there is a struggle with the word. And that will always be there because at this point, if we think about what gender is in a global perspective, gender is first and foremost a problem for translation. It doesn't have a single meaning that is true for all places. It's a problem for translation.
In your recent book, The Force of Nonviolence, you criticized a lot against individualism, but many have taken your earlier books, for example, Gender Trouble, as works promoting freedom and individuality. How your theory of gender performativity and constructivism can be a critic against individualism.
Well, I mean, even in the early work, it seemed to me that I was actually talking about the feminist movement and the queer movement and the LGBTQ movement. So the forms of freedom I was seeking to describe were not just individual, but also social. But I think it's true that I've had to make that more explicit in my more recent work. Um, I think as I reflect on the feminist movement and the LGBTQI movement, um, I see that there have been networks that have supported people, networks of solidarity, networks of support. And we see this, I think, also in the pandemic, mutual aid societies, networks of radical care. People had to show up for each other, especially if they were disowned by their family or they suffered isolation or marginalization in society. They made their own communities to support one another. And this is a very important concept for me going forward. Um, I talk about it in terms of forms of protest, but I also talk about it in terms of a vision of the world in which we no longer use violence to settle um, our conflicts. Um, and my sense is that we have to understand ourselves as our own lives as interdependent, as linked with the lives of others, not just in our community or in our country, but in the entire world, in order to understand why we need to preserve those bonds, and not strike at those bonds, which is what we do when we engage in violence. So um, I think maybe my ideas of interdependency or my critique of individualism emerges from my reflections on social movements and forms of solidarity, many of which are trans-regional and which seek to provide networks of support for people who are trying to build a different kind of world.
There is a question from the audience, Dipasish Mishra. According to a recent UN report, today more people than ever live in a country other than the one in which they were born. In 2019, the number of migrants globally reached an estimated 272 million. Growing migration is antagonistic to the surge of intense nationalism in some countries. In this context, how important is the idea of precariousness, which, according to you, implies living socially? That is the fact that one's life is always, in some sense, in the hands of the others, a dependency on people we know or barely know or know not at all.
Um, well, I think it's true. I don't know the statistics for forced and voluntary migration at this point, but we know that because of war, uh, because of poverty, um, because of other forms of violence, many people have had to leave their countries of origin and seek refuge elsewhere. And of course, international law um, provides a right to seek asylum um, in any country that has signed the international covenants uh, governing migration. And yet, we see more and more countries closing their walls, their borders, setting up uh, strict security protocols and setting up detention camps. My own country has detention camps. We know China's detention camps. We know the detention camps that are bordering Europe, trying to keep out people from Syria um, or the Kurds or a number of people from North Africa. Um, Unfortunately, this mode of detention has become the most dominant form of imprisonment. It's imprisonment without a charge. It's imprisonment without a trial. It's detention without knowing when it will end. And of course, even for people who are able to pass into other countries, they are very often treated as second class citizens, have not always having the same rights or being asked to wait for so many years before they are given um, citizenship or legal rights. And we know, for instance, in Lebanon, that there are Palestinian families who've been refugees for 6 decades, who live generation upon generation as refugees. So, um, I mean, I think the term precarity describes the situation of being at the mercy of others, not having enough to live well, to live safely, to be exposed to the elements or to be exposed to hunger, to be exposed to violence, and to be also suffering from a sense of not belonging. But the reason for precarity, I mean, and there are many, precarity can be produced through war, it can be produced through capitalism, it can be produced through um, intense poverty or famine or natural catastrophe. But the question, of course, that I have is whether we have set up locally, nationally, internationally, the kinds of networks that receive people and which understand that everyone has a right to be received, that everybody has a right to be welcomed and to be received and to be given rights. Everybody has a right to belong. And that was something that Hannah Arendt suggested in her own work, that um, the right to have rights is not a right to belong to this country or that country, but it is a right that everyone has, no matter what country they are in, to have rights. So it's not secured by local law, it's not even secured by national constitutions. It is, um, it is a philosophically based right to have a right. And I would say that the right to belong belongs to every human being because they are in the hands of the other. We are each in the hands of the other, which is why every time we encounter precarity, we ought to be received in some way by an institution or by another who can ameliorate that condition, because in the condition of precarity, it is hard to persist in life, and we only persist in life through the social structures, the infrastructures, and the political structures that make it possible for us to persist.
There is a question in chat from Muis Tandwala. State and law have historically and conceptually been understood as masculine constructs in much of the modern world. How then can they be reframed and reimagined through the prism of gender? Or will the gender question always remain associated at best with politics of resistance rather than radically recreating a new political order of freedom?
Well, that's a great question, and it suggests to me that whoever has formulated that question has a very important theory to offer. So whoever you are, I would suggest to you that you put that theory into writing and put it into the world, because you have something very important to say. um, I I don't know. I do think the history of law and the history of political structures is a difficult one, to the extent that the realm of law and the realm of politics have been understood as separate from the domestic space, the space of reproduction and care. Then we can ask whether a law that starts from the point of view of the household, or from the point of view of manual work, a law that starts with a different perspective, not how to contain or control the population, but rather that emerges from the people and from those who have not been traditionally enfranchised, including women. What difference would that make in the law? Maybe that would be a more democratic law. Maybe it would be a law that is about providing social goods rather than repressing freedoms. It's a very excellent question. I don't have a full answer for you, but I thank you for the question.
Here is another question about the pandemic. Will self isolation reality change our perception and performativity of gender, as we are now having a shift in how we look and dress while being at home for prolonged periods of time?
Well, it's true when we say that gender is performative. Um, Maybe we mean that gender is performed by our clothes, or the way we look, or the way others see us. That is the most popular interpretation of my theory. Um, but it's been 30 years since I wrote that, so you have to allow me to have a change of view. And uh, and I don't think that gender is just the performance of how we look or how we seem to others. It's also very much about what kind of social norms we accept and how we struggle with them in our lives, whether they're norms regarding work or sexuality or appearance or education or marriage. All of those are norms that we are asked to reproduce, and that we can depart from. We can try to conform, we can try to depart, we can try to redefine them in our own way. So these are sites of struggle, because we are asked to reproduce them, and yet maybe we go on strike and we don't reproduce them, or maybe we reproduce them in a way we were not supposed to. So there are these possibilities that emerge from the reproduction of norms, and that's the way I see the performativity of gender. It's true that we are more isolated. We also connect with each other through these visual means, so we see each other mainly from the shoulders and the head. But some people are performing on Zoom, right? There's some beautiful dances on Zoom. There's great gymnastics on Zoom. There's great theater on Zoom. There's some poetry, there's jazz, there's many things that are happening on Zoom that show people in different lights. So some of it is more finely constructed, and other times it's just much more casual. We're in each other's homes. We're suddenly exposed in our domestic spaces, and that breaks down this relationship between the public and the private sphere in a way that is, on the one hand, perhaps a little invasive, but maybe also good, because we are complex beings who have to live somewhere, who have to live someplace safe, hopefully, right? Uh, in order to negotiate the pandemic. So it makes us think about the living character of each other in a different way when we connect through the pandemic. And some of that is about gender, um, for sure, but maybe not all of it.
And a question from Salmuli Chadori. Now that we have closely witnessed the limits of multicultural identitarian politics, is there a more generative way of politicizing the gender question today? Does this also require us to challenge the widely popular analytical frameworks such as intersectionality?
Well, I think multiculturalism and intersectionality help us to describe uh, the different ways that each of us experience religion or gender or race or class or nationality. I mean, we are the intersection of all those things. And if we are to be understood, someone has to understand that complexity. Um, and intersectionality, of course, began as a legal theory, a feminist legal theory, black feminist legal theory, that sought to establish in a court of law how a particular woman or a class of women can experience a double oppression at the same time. Um, ex- they experience harassment or they experience violence, and it is an attack on them not just as a woman but also as a black woman. So I think that these frameworks are important for us to grasp the complexity of who we are and the complex ways that power works, to exclude people, to demean them, to also to establish forms of supremacy, whether it's religious, racial, or gender supremacy. Um, but they are analytics. That is to say, they help us understand a sociological and historical situation. They are not of themselves a larger normative vision of how we should live. In other words, the question that I started with, the question that I said belongs to political philosophy. How do we live with each other? Um, that's not yet approached by those questions. So I suppose I am interested, especially during the pandemic, to see the new ideas of socialism that are not necessarily state socialism, the new ideas of ecology and ecological socialism, um, the new forms of trans regional solidarity in defense of the planet and the climate, to defend the earth. Um, these are extremely important movements that I think, and I guess I would include Black Lives Matter here, which is about the achievement of racial justice. They have, I think, very strong aims, strong norms, strong aspirations, and they are, I think, among the most compelling of the social movements in our time. I would also include the human rights for refugees, and the movement against inhumane detention centers and detention practices. Um, that I take to be a transnational movement that affects people um, throughout Latin America, throughout Europe, um, throughout Central Asia and East Asia for sure. So we 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 need to think more about that. But these movements carry ideals in them, and I think maybe philosophers and social critics need to try um, to understand what those ideals are and to make them more public, to make them more available to public debate.
And Kurt Borg is asking, how do you envision the role of practices of writing philosophy today in a world bombarded by information and data? And on a more personal, practical level, how do you write? How has your relation with writing developed over time? Your writing style can be said to have shifted from texts like bodies that matter to giving an account of oneself. Would you agree?
Um, well, I don't give a good account of myself, so it's hard for me to agree or disagree. I do note, however, that my writing practice has changed. I think that I was more internal to a certain academic practice 30 years ago, and now I'm trying to speak to maybe more people or in a more accessible way. Um, so, so yes, there's been a shift. There's no question in my mind. Um, there it is a world of information and data. It's also a world of conspiracy and hacking. It's also a world of denying facts and radical censorship. So it's not that we're flooded with the truth or flooded with information. We're flooded with some information, and other information is kept from us. So we do need to think about the forms of surveillance and censorship that are operating within our informational platforms and our digital worlds. At the same time, I think it's never been more important to to promote forms of thinking and writing that ask about evidence, that ask about argument. Is this coherent? Is it contradictory? Who does this argument serve? On what set of evidence is it based? What evidence has been left out? What has been put in? We have to think critically. Um, and to think critically is not to destroy everything, but it is to ask what am I being told is knowledge? How is knowledge delimited? What is said to be not knowledge, right? Like, so, oh, we want social equality, but gender gets in the way of social equality. Well, maybe it is incoherent to have an idea of social equality that excludes gender, right? Because what if somebody says, "Oh, social equality is important. Gender is a disturbance. It interferes with our project of social equality." Well, what they're saying is gender inequality can stay, and whatever social equality means will not take into account gender. So it's a new structure of inequality. So what is the argument being made? We can look at some of the arguments against trans identity in Poland or Romania or Hungary, the arguments against gender and gender studies in all of those places, in Switzerland. What is the argument? What are they saying? Is gender a destructive category? Will it destroy people's lives, or will it open their lives? Will it actually lift shame off of some people who suffer it? Will it promote equality? Will it open up people's lives so that they are more livable than they were before? We need to have strong arguments to counter some of those kinds of charges and allegations. And I think a certain kind of public thinking in various public media on issues such as this are really important, are really urgent.
There is another question about your works. If people in this region, Central Asia, Afghanistan, were supposed to be your main audience, would you take a different approach in describing your ideas? I wonder if you presuppose a specific audience while writing, or you have a more universal audience in mind.
Well, I am used to the fact that my work gets translated into languages I cannot read. And when that happens, the work becomes a different work. It belongs to me, but it also belongs to that language. And I like that. I don't need to know how they're translating this word and I give it away, right? You give a book to another language, it becomes another kind of book, and it intersects with people's thinking and their history of thought in a way that I could not know. So I'm very grateful to the translators. Nobody can write a book um, uh, knowing who their audience is. I think perhaps in the last years, because of the reception of my work, my own understanding has become more global in nature. Um, so it's not that I'm not writing for this group or I'm not writing for this group. It's that I don't know how it will be taken up. I mean, a book is kind of it's it's thrown out there and it gets taken up in ways that are completely surprising. And then sometimes I learn about that, and that's a true gift.
Uh, Denise Nazarova is asking, what ways do you consider efficient in terms of bringing philosophy and academia in activism? I mean, activism tends to fall into populism, which leads to nothing but more disputes. Example, current attitude to feminism. How can we prevent that?
Um, the only way to prevent that is perhaps by making knowledge more available. So, activism is not just acting, it's also thinking, it's also reflecting and reading. And most of the activists I know, they go back to school for a while, they read, they understand the history of other social movements, and then they re enter their own activist domains with a different set of perspectives. So I actually think intellectual reflection and social activism belong together in a kind of rhythm, maybe even a dialectic of sorts. Um, I also think that we shouldn't lose our minds when we become activists. We have to use our minds. That we have to make good judgments and we have to be collaborative. We also have to think about how uh, to be proactive in the media, not just defending ourselves when attacked, but actually providing for occasions for people to learn about concepts or social movements that are frightening to them or make them anxious. And that can happen through art, it can happen through public educational forums. It can happen in many ways. Um, Sometimes even just through local community discussions. But I think that it's important um, to distribute knowledge and to distribute it in a way that people can grasp what's being said, so that at least it becomes a debate rather than an attack or an effort at repression.
Thank you. Veronica is asking, in past decades, we observe mainly feminist discourse that emphasize that range of rights and social roles attributed to women. Is there any evidence that men also experiences identity crisis in response to feminist movements? How do men deal with societal demands? How men who understand feminist agenda do envision themselves, their social role in modern world?
Yes, I think that's a great question. I think many men struggle with the demands on them to be men of a certain kind. And depending where you live in the world, the ideals of masculinity differ. Um, and I think in many countries there are also conflicts among ideals of masculinity, like some of them being very violent, others being um, very civil. Um, the, but men, I think, also uh, can benefit from a critical understanding of gender because they are also forced in many cases to conform to norms that don't always suit them or are not quite right for them. Um, so there's some very interesting work in men's studies and masculinity studies. I think we also have to consider that masculinity is something that doesn't just belong to men, that masculinity can belong to women or to others who do not define themselves as man or woman. Um, it's an interesting and important topic, and if the goal is to make life more livable for everyone, as I think it is, then opening up masculinity to more livable forms is good. I even think men who commit violence are sometimes traumatized by their own violence and suffer from it. And we don't pay enough attention to that because we think of them as the abuser or uh, the person in the superior dominant position of power. But men who go to war very often suffer for years, or they find life after war unlivable. And I'm sure many of you already know this. But I think we should have a much more open attitude, and I think men benefit from feminism. It's also been interesting for me. I was in Spain, and some man said, "Well, the women are marching in the street against sexual violence." I said, "Yes, it's very impressive." He said, I wish I could join them." I said, "Well, why can't you join them?" He said, "Well, I wouldn't be welcome as a man." I said, "Why not? You go with, there would be nothing more important. There would be nothing more moving than having a group of men join women in the fight against sexual violence. Because not all men are engaged in sexual violence, and many men oppose sexual violence. And why shouldn't they be part of it? I thought men can be feminists and are feminists, and it makes a huge difference when they are.
And thank you. Central Asian societies are mostly patriarchal, and there is a fear that part of our values would be challenged by new ideas coming from the outside world. Will some of our cultural values be lost if new ideals are incorporated in the society? Is it a good idea to incorporate feministic ideals in a time of ethnic and cultural rebuilding?
Well, my first question is, what would it mean to rebuild a culture without incorporating feminist ideals? What would you be rebuilding? Rebuilding
Mhm.
patriarchy. We're trying to rebuild patriarchy. Do not get in the way of rebuilding patriarchy. So that doesn't make sense to me. If you're going to rebuild a world, it should be, well, firstly, multi ethnic, but also um, gender aware, feminist, committed to equality, committed to the fight against violence, especially domestic violence, which is too often considered a kind of right of husbands. Um, so rebuilding is great. I would take that part and say rebuilding is great, but you cannot rebuild without this. But also, is it really true that the critique of patriarchy only comes from the outside? I don't really believe that. I mean, if I were there, that's the question I would be asking you, after the talk and in the meal. I would be saying, so what is the local critique of patriarchy? What form does that take? What have women been doing for decades, if not centuries, in order to negotiate with patriarchy or to find their way? I want to know, what are the histories of leaving patriarchal systems, of subverting it from within, right? That's what I would want to know. I mean, I think if we act like this feminism is coming from outside, then there's some falsehood is being told about local culture and regional history.
Yeah, that's unfortunate that feminism is seen something from outside.
Yes, but
Mhm,
maybe there's another word or another way of describing what has always been inside,
mhm,
right? And it's important to start at the grassroots level, to start in your local communities with your own languages and your own ways of speaking with families and in communities. You know, how are these issues being addressed? What is the idiom there? You know, and if feminism is connected to outside, then it has to be part of a solidarity that respects the various cultural differences, right? It
mhm.
can't just be imposed from the outside. That part I actually agree with.
Yeah. Uh, a question from Elira Turdabayeva. What do you think of a strategic sisterhood? How can we promote feminism in Islamic countries where Sharia is limiting them?
Well, um, I don't have an easy answer except that I know that a couple of years ago there were 3,000 women attending a conference in France called Women Feminism in Islam, you know, so there are already like established groups. I know there are established groups in Afghanistan. I know there are established groups in various countries. So that's the place to start. Like, what are those groups and what have they published and how are they connected with one another? Um, I I think it's extremely important to be mindful of that because there again you get the idea that oh feminism is coming from outside, but actually there have been feminist interpretations of the Quran for decades. In Egypt, I know four schools that four schools of feminist interpretation. So let us not act like oh there's Sharia and then there's feminism outside. I don't think that's true.
Yeah, thank you. A question from Oksana. From your point of view, why Belarusian is so many way patriarchal society accept a woman to protest leadership? I mean, today's more than 100 days protest movement against turning government system. I I don't know what's the question. Why Belarusian is in so many way patriarchal society? I think it's
Um, oh, in Belarus, yeah. Oh, well, look, I am just learning about Belarus. I'm following, I'm interested, but I don't feel like I am that I know enough to comment on it.
mhm.
My guess is that you have more to teach me about what's happening there than I can teach you.
Yeah, I don't know it either. Um, there's another question. What new problems are women facing in our era, and what should be the main focus of feministic movements at the moment?
Well, I think the main focus of feminist movements should be to achieve literacy for more women, to help more women to get out of poverty, and to help women in their struggle against abuse and sexual violence. Um, and the reasons for this is that you know you have to eat in order to live well. You have to read in order to understand your world, and you have to be free of violence in order to breathe and in order to feel joy and to exist with others with trust and hope. So, you know, for me, the task is to create conditions for a more livable life. And that can't happen for women without opposing those forms of oppression very clearly. But I also think the feminist movement needs to be linked with other movements, like the movement to save the earth and to develop communities of care that extend beyond our nations and regions and help build visions of what it would be um, to live on this earth, preserving preserving this earth and the health of the people and promoting social ideals of equality. So we have to be in coalitions, even though it's sometimes very hard. I mean, most feminists are afraid of being in coalitions because it means they usually get subordinated. But we have to struggle. Um, it's an ongoing struggle here as everywhere else.
Yeah. Someone is asking that, uh, can you please share some recommendations on reading materials about masculinity?
Uh, yes, there is an entire book in English called Masculinity Studies.
Mhm.
Um, there is an important work by Jack Halberstam called Female Masculinity. Um, uh, I think those are the two things I'm thinking of right away.
Okay. There is a last question because we only have, I think, 10 minutes. Yeah. Uh, so, as it's World Philosophy Day, what do you think? How much liberal arts studies, especially philosophy, is important for a better world?
Yes. Well, you know, throughout the world, we're seeing that universities are deciding to fund the sciences and technology studies, what are very often called STEM fields. And it does worry me that the arts and humanities are underfunded and that very often universities are willing to let those go. But in the arts and humanities programs, I mean, that's where we learn languages, first of all, which allows us all to become in contact with one another when we otherwise wouldn't be able to. Um, but we also learn the arts of interpretation and what it means to make a judgment on the basis of sound evidence. Um, I mean, I live in a country in which the president makes up facts and lies and cheats. I mean, I know many people live in those countries, but it's extremely important that people be able to see, well, what is evidence for the claim? What is what is the interpretation? What is the framework in which this person is speaking? And in English classes, in language and literature classes, we we're always we're always asking, okay, so what is that person saying, and how do they back up their view, and to whom are they speaking, and what is their motivation, right? And then we do an analysis of a poem or a story or something like that. And in philosophy as well, I think we ask very fundamental questions, but more often than not, our questions, they come from the books we read, but they also come from the world that we live in. So even the question of what will the world look like after the pandemic, we have to imagine that world, right? That's an act of imagination. And to some degree, it's an act of political imagination. Like, how will we live together? Let us imagine it now. Let us start to build it now before everything opens and the earth becomes destroyed and climate change accelerates and rates of poverty are escalating. So, you know, it's it's extremely important that we keep the idealistic questions open and not be mocked or ridiculed by asking what is justice, what is equality, what is freedom, how do I live, how should I live, how should we live together. I mean, I've just mentioned those as some, but we have to imagine those answers. We reason about them, we're thoughtful about them, but most philosophy also involves acts of imagination. Even in Kant, he says, act in such a way that you would accept a world in which every other person acted in that same way. Well, you have to imagine that world. It's like, oh, I'm imagining that world. There's an act of imagination that allows us to move outside of ourselves and accept that we live in a world with others, and that we have to find ways of doing that. And I think that's true not just within nations or communities or families, but really transnationally and transregionally. I would love to see philosophy in a trans-regional imagination, in actively imagining a post-pandemic world.
Mhm.
Um, how should this world be made? How should we remake the world? How do we rebuild society? How do we come back together after this isolation? Those are those are acts of imagination and thought, but they're also commitments to certain kinds of uh, important principles like justice and equality and freedom and and anti-violence, quite frankly.
Mhm. And there is another question. I think we have a few minutes. Can corporate work and feminism ever go together? Do we advocate for remunerating women working in a household, or should the demand be to distribute labor across gender?
Well, my short answer is household labor should be shared.
Mhm.
It rarely is, but it should be shared. um, and I think maybe we have to rethink what it is to live a life. I mean, and this is part of what we see in the pandemic. It's like we have to reproduce the home. We have to live in a space. We need food. We need to um, we need safety. We need heat. Um, and as because we're bodies living in the world with basic life requirements at the same time that we move into the world into jobs where we are already fed or we're already slept, right? But that private life is not brought into that more public work world. And women are used to that split, like, oh, that's what I do at home and this is what I do at work. But actually, more and more, as we think about work arrangements, we should be thinking, what do people need for their lives? What are the right hours? When do they need to be at home? When do they need to be at work? In other words, not just think of people as labor to be calculated, like how useful will it be, how productive will it be, but as lives that are seeking to live well. Like, are they properly fed? Are they getting the health insurance? What kind of work are they doing? Is it the best work for them? What kind of work would they like to do? How might they move into new work that is better for them? I mean, we really do need to refocus the question of labor um, on the question of what it is to live um, to live. I don't want to say live well, but live in a livable way. Live in a way that allows one to take joy in life and feel creativity in life, and and connect with others in ways that are actually meaningful. So I guess I'm asking for a more humanized work environment, or one that recognizes that the lives at work are also lives at home, and that we appreciate that uh, that dual, at least dual dimension of of workers, um, that we not just treat them as as productive and replaceable labor, and not care what happens to them afterwards, or where they're coming from, or how they are.
Mhm. Many thanks, Professor Butler, for coming. I know it's too late in Berkeley.
It's
And
okay. It's okay.
yeah, it was really interesting, and especially your questions that you posed us. Like, I know that we live in the society, but those gender issues and feministic movements are not studies, it's our problems. Like, we don't work a lot in academic area. Many thanks, and many thanks for people who joined us today. Thank you.
Yes, I'm very pleased. Thank you for your excellent questions, and thank you for inviting me to join you. I'm very honored. Thank you. Okay.
You're welcome. Have a
Okay.
good time.
Have a good day. Okay.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.